My name is Laura, and I want to tell you about a part of my life that shaped me in ways I never imagined. I'm a 38-year-old real estate agent, and my life has taken me through a roller coaster of emotions and experiences. I'm still processing it all, but here's how it unfolded. 6 years ago, I was happily married to my first husband, James. He was an architect, full of ambition and dreams. But fate had other plans. One day, while working on a construction site, a terrible accident took him from me. I was left alone, navigating the world as a widow. The grief was overwhelming, and the void he left was immense. In the aftermath, I inherited around $400,000, a portion of which was shared with James's family. Financially, I was secure, but emotionally, I felt hollow. The pain of losing him was raw and relentless. I continued working, trying to keep myself busy and focused, but loneliness was my constant companion. It was during this challenging period that I met Tom. He was a cheerful and easygoing colleague in the tech industry. His laughter and optimism were like a breath of fresh air in my life. Tom had this way of making everything seem lighter, even when I was struggling internally. We became friends, and over time, his presence filled a part of my heart that I didn't realize was still aching. Tom was a former software engineer who had left his career to help his aging father. We started dating, and his charm was irresistible. It wasn't long before we decided to marry. It felt like a new beginning, a chance to rebuild and find happiness again. Tom grew up with his father, Frank, who was a 75-year-old retired entrepreneur. Frank had built several successful businesses throughout his career, but he was known for being frugal. Tom, on the other hand, never understood his father's cautious approach to money. To him, Frank seemed stingy and overly careful. After our wedding, Tom convinced me to move in with Frank. His health was declining, and he needed help with daily tasks. Tom decided to quit his job and become a full-time homemaker, taking on the responsibility of caring for his father. I supported this decision, although it meant taking on more responsibilities myself. I continued working as a real estate agent, managing both my career and the growing demands of our home life. In the beginning, Tom was attentive. He managed household chores and took care of Frank as promised. However, as time went on, his enthusiasm waned. His efforts began to dwindle, and he became increasingly lazy. The burden of housework fell on me, despite my demanding job. I found myself juggling both roles, feeling the strain of balancing work and home life, while Tom seemed indifferent to the responsibilities he had once eagerly embraced. Frank, despite his declining health, was always kind to me. He shared stories of his entrepreneurial ventures, including a project that had gone awry, a luxury textile business in Italy. It was an extravagant venture that had consumed much of Frank's wealth. He spoke of it with a mix of regret and wisdom, a reminder of the risks involved in business. Tom never appreciated his father's careful handling of money. He frequently called Frank stingy and complained about not living more lavishly. His constant dissatisfaction with Frank's frugality was a source of tension between them. Tom's attitude began to impact our relationship, and I felt caught in the middle. As Tom's laziness increased, so did his spending habits. He started using my savings to buy luxury items like designer watches and high-end electronics without asking for my permission. When I discovered that he had drained nearly $20,000 in just a few weeks, I was furious. I confronted him, demanding to know why he had been so reckless with our finances. Despite the confrontation, I hesitated to take drastic steps like filing for divorce. My main concern was Frank. He was still dependent on us for care, and I didn't want to leave him in a vulnerable position. I chose to stay, hoping things might improve, while dealing with the growing frustration of Tom's financial irresponsibility. Little did I know that the real shock was yet to come. Frank's health continued to decline, and it was clear that his time was drawing near. The atmosphere in the house grew heavier, and Tom's dissatisfaction became more pronounced. As we approached the end, I was unaware of the storm that was brewing beneath the surface, waiting to unravel everything I thought I knew about our lives. Frank passed away quietly one evening, his departure marking the end of an era and the beginning of a new chapter for me and Tom. It was a somber time, and the house felt emptier than ever. The funeral was filled with mourners, and as we moved through the formalities, Tom's demeanor was unsettlingly calm. He seemed detached, almost too composed. In the days following the funeral, something changed in Tom. He was suddenly more focused on the financial side of things, and his attitude became increasingly arrogant. It was then that he revealed his true intentions. "I need to talk to you about something important," Tom said one afternoon, his tone carrying an edge I hadn't heard before. "What is it?" I asked, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. Tom handed me a stack of papers. "I've been thinking. Since Frank is gone, I believe there's a significant inheritance coming our way. I've done some calculations, and I'm confident it's around $200 million. I was stunned. $200 million? How did you come to that figure? Tom leaned back, a smug smile on his face. Frank's business ventures were risky, but he was wealthy. I've looked into things, and it seems that this amount is what he left behind. I was confused. But Frank always spoke about the failed textile business in Italy. He lost a lot of money on that. Tom waved his hand dismissively. That's just what he wanted us to believe. The real money is tied up elsewhere. The more Tom spoke, the more uneasy I became. It felt like he was spinning a tale to suit his own narrative. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about his claims. Tom's behavior became more erratic. He started making grand plans about how we would spend the inheritance. Designer clothes, luxury vacations, and high-end cars were all part of his vision. He made no effort to hide his excitement, and it was clear that he had already spent a significant amount of money in his mind. One day, I discovered that Tom had been using our savings to buy extravagant items without consulting me. There were receipts for designer watches, top-tier electronics, and even a high-end sports car. When I confronted him about it, he brushed off my concerns with a wave of his hand. "It's all going to be worth it, Laura. Once the inheritance comes through, we'll have more than enough," he said with a dismissive tone. I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. Despite the confrontation, I was torn. The idea of leaving Tom while dealing with Frank's estate seemed daunting. I was worried about the impact on Frank's legacy and the potential chaos that could ensue. Tom's spending continued unabated. He drained nearly $20,000 from our savings in just a few weeks, leaving me feeling helpless and betrayed. I confronted him again, but his response was always the same, assurances that everything would be fine once the inheritance came through. As the days turned into weeks, the tension between us grew. Tom's laziness was now matched by his reckless spending. He was more focused on his imagined fortune than on the reality of our situation. I felt increasingly isolated and frustrated, struggling to balance my job and the responsibilities at home while Tom did nothing to help. It was clear that Tom's expectations were unrealistic. He continued to live in a fantasy world where $200 million was just around the corner, while the reality of our finances and his irresponsible behavior weighed heavily on me. One evening, as I was going through some paperwork, I came across a document from Frank's lawyer. It was an outline of Frank's financial situation and estate planning. My heart raced as I read through the details. The luxury textile business in Italy had indeed consumed a significant portion of Frank's wealth, but what caught my eye was the information about collateral for debts. It was clear now. The $200 million Tom had been counting on was actually tied up as collateral for Frank's failed business venture. The real inheritance amounted to only $40,000, a modest sum compared to Tom's expectations. I felt a mix of relief and dread. The truth was finally out, and it was worse than I had imagined. Tom's fantasies were about to come crashing down, and I had to confront the reality of our situation. The day came when Frank's estate was to be settled. Tom was exuberant, making grand plans for the future. I remained quiet, knowing that the truth would soon shatter his illusions. As Tom eagerly awaited the inheritance, I prepared myself for the inevitable confrontation. The day arrived when the estate details were to be finalized, and the air was thick with anticipation. Tom had been eagerly preparing for what he was certain would be the beginning of a new, opulent chapter in his life. I, on the other hand, had spent the past few days grappling with the truth of Frank's financial situation and the reality of the inheritance. Tom's optimism was palpable as he paraded around the house, discussing future plans that included lavish vacations, a new mansion, and luxury vehicles. I could barely contain my anxiety. I knew that the truth would hit Tom like a freight train, and I had no idea how he would react. That morning, Tom was in high spirits, confident that his calculations and expectations would be confirmed. We had a meeting with Frank's lawyer to finalize the estate matters. Tom was dressed in his best suit, exuding a misplaced confidence that only made my unease grow. As we sat in the lawyer's office, the tension was almost unbearable. The lawyer, Mr. Harrison, started by reviewing the financial documents and discussing the estate distribution. Tom leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat and began. As per the last will and testament of Frank Collins, the estate has been evaluated and the assets are allocated as follows. Tom's excitement was evident, and he barely let Mr. Harrison finish his sentences. But as the lawyer continued, it became clear that Tom's expectations were about to be shattered. Due to Frank's failed business venture in Italy, a substantial portion of his wealth was used as collateral for debts. Consequently, the majority of the $200 million is tied up in debt repayment, Mr. Harrison explained. Tom's face fell.
What?
That can't be right. There must be some mistake. I watched as Tom's world crumbled before my eyes. Mr. Harrison continued calmly. The real net inheritance amounts to $40,000. The rest is encumbered by the debts from the failed venture. Tom's anger erupted. This can't be happening. I've already spent so much, expecting a fortune. There's no way this is true. The lawyer tried to maintain his composure. I understand this is a difficult situation, Mr. Collins, but the financial details are accurate. The debts were substantial, and Frank's assets were used to cover them. Tom's frustration boiled over. You have to be kidding me. I've been living in a fantasy for months, thinking I was going to be rich. How could Frank do this? I felt a pang of sympathy mixed with relief. I knew how devastating this was for Tom, but I also knew it was the harsh reality he needed to face. The facade of a golden future was crumbling, and the weight of his own greed was becoming painfully evident. Tom stormed out of the office, his face flushed with rage and disbelief. I followed him, trying to keep my composure. As we got into the car, Tom's anger was palpable. He started shouting, his words a mix of curses and accusations. This is all your fault, he yelled. You knew about the debts, didn't you? You kept this from me. I was taken aback. Tom, I didn't know for sure. I only discovered the truth recently. I tried to warn you. Tom's anger didn't subside. You should have told me earlier. Now I'm left with nothing because of you. I remained silent, realizing that no amount of explanation would change Tom's perception. His world was in ruins, and he was desperately looking for someone to blame. That evening, Tom was a different person. The person who had been so optimistic and full of grand plans was now a shadow of himself. He was bitter, disillusioned, and struggling to accept the reality of his situation. I could see how much his own expectations had clouded his judgment and led him to squander our resources. Tom tried to reach out to me, begging for another chance. Laura, please. I was wrong. I spent too much, and I thought we were going to be wealthy.
Can we work something out?
I looked at him with a mix of sadness and determination. Tom, you can't keep blaming others for your mistakes. You had your chance to be honest and responsible, but you chose to live in a fantasy. I can't continue like this. His pleas continued, but I was resolute. I had seen enough. The man I had married was not the person I thought I knew. His greed and entitlement had blinded him to reality, and now he was paying the price. The $40,000 that remained from Frank's estate felt like a small consolation prize compared to the grand dreams Tom had built up. It was a modest sum, but it was enough for me to start anew. I knew I had to move on, to find my own path away from the chaos and betrayal that had marked my marriage. As Tom struggled to cope with his financial reality, I began making plans to move out. It was a difficult decision, but I felt it was necessary for my own well-being. The journey ahead was uncertain, but I was determined to face it with courage and resilience. As I prepared to leave the house for the last time, the weight of the past few months settled heavily on my shoulders. Tom's reaction to the estate's reality had been explosive and unsettling, and now, as I packed up the last of my belongings, I couldn't help but reflect on how far I'd come from the person I was when we first met. The small apartment I had rented was modest, but comfortable. It was a far cry from the grand houses Tom had dreamed of, but it represented a new beginning, a chance to rebuild my life on my own terms. I had managed to set aside the $40,000 inheritance from Frank, and while it wasn't a fortune, it was enough to start fresh. Tom, meanwhile, was spiraling further into despair. The realization that the $200 million was nothing more than a myth had hit him hard. He had already spent much of his savings in anticipation of the inheritance, and now, with only the $40,000 to fall back on, he faced a bleak financial future. I'd seen him on a few occasions after the estate meeting, but he was barely recognizable as the man I had married. His once bright and hopeful demeanor had been replaced with a defeated and bitter attitude. One afternoon, a week after the estate fiasco, I received a call from Tom. His voice was tinged with desperation. "Laura, I'm struggling. I've been trying to get by, but it's not working. I can't keep up with my bills. Can you help me?" I was torn. On one hand, I felt a pang of sympathy for him. On the other, I had to remind myself of the reason I left. "Tom, I've been trying to move on and find my own path. I'm not in a position to help you financially. You need to figure things out on your own." He sighed heavily. "I get it. I've made mistakes, and I'm paying for them now. I'm sorry for everything." It was the first time he had truly admitted his faults to me. His apology was a small step, but it didn't change the fact that our lives had diverged irreparably. I hoped he would use this moment of clarity to turn his life around, but I couldn't be a part of that process. With the apartment set up and my job continuing to provide a stable income, I found a sense of peace in my new routine. I had started to reconnect with old friends and rediscover interests that had been overshadowed during my marriage. It was an empowering experience, one that reminded me of my own strength and resilience. A few months later, I received a letter from Frank's lawyer. It was a brief but kind note, acknowledging the difficult situation and offering a small token of appreciation for my support during Frank's final days. Enclosed was a check for $5,000. It was a generous gesture, but more than that, it symbolized Frank's acknowledgement of my role in his life. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a reminder that even in the face of betrayal, there were still small acts of kindness and recognition. Tom's situation, on the other hand, continued to deteriorate. I heard from mutual acquaintances that he had taken a part-time job, struggling to make ends meet. His financial troubles were compounded by his inability to cope with the reality of his situation. I knew that Tom had always been driven by a desire for wealth and status, and without the inheritance he had so eagerly anticipated, he was left grappling with his own sense of worth. As time went on, I began to see the benefits of the choices I had made. The independence I had fought for was more than just financial, it was a reclaiming of my own life and identity. I felt a renewed sense of purpose and clarity. The lessons learned from my relationship with Tom and the betrayal I had endured had strengthened me. I knew that I could face whatever challenges came my way with resilience and self-awareness. One evening, as I sat in my new apartment, looking out over the city, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The pain and hardship I had experienced were now distant memories, overshadowed by the strength I had gained. The past had shaped me, but it no longer defined me. Tom's story was a cautionary tale of greed and entitlement, a reminder of how easily one could be blinded by the lure of easy money and false promises. My story was one of recovery and self-discovery. I had learned to value myself beyond material wealth and had found peace in living authentically. As I closed the door to the apartment and stepped into the night, I felt a sense of finality and freedom. The future was uncertain, but it was mine to shape. I walked confidently into the city, ready to embrace whatever lay ahead, knowing that I had emerged from the shadows of my past stronger and wiser.